Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the co-writer of the graphic novel series Five Worlds, as well as the founder and editorial director of First Second, a publisher of graphic novels for all ages. It's Mark Siegel. Thanks for coming on, Mark.
Thank you, David. Lovely to be here.
Happy Friday. How's your Friday going?
It is icy in New York. Right now, I look out the window and the car is coated in a quarter inch of ice.
Oof. Yeah.
So that's what it's like. Everything is turning slick. It's all been wet and now it's going to be slippery.
This is one of those very rare scenarios where I, a person from Alaska, can say, I am not envious of your weather.
Yeah, it's like when it's warmer there.
It is. It snowed a bit, but at the same time, snow is manageable. That much ice, no thank you.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm sure you get this question a lot just because we discussed before we started recording, you have like multiple hats. What is a day like for you? Because you're one of the rare people who is like a top person at a publisher, but you're also a creator. What is a day for you like?
I'd say there's no typical day, but I've kind of broken out my week into focus. So there's a couple of days where the priority is my studio life, but then there's, full work days with First Second. And so it's like there'll be some days, where I'm really just kind of from early morning to the end of the day focused on the editorial stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I've tried different combinations of managing my week, and it's never a perfect balance, but there's generally, I reserve some sacred time to make sure there's going to be, I knew when I started First Second that it would be a terrible mistake to just put a hold on my own projects. I've seen people make that decision in life and like put on one side their painting passion or their music passion or something, for later, and then that later never comes. So I decided from the start, and it was part of my negotiation with Macmillan when I started First Second, I was like, I need to be able to keep going with my projects. That's kind of non-negotiable.
Well, it's interesting because you have different hats, and they obviously they are very different responsibilities, different roles and everything like that. But it is fascinating because I imagine one side typically, it's like you can't separate your editor brain from your, creator brain, I'm sure, and vice versa. It's like they're always kind of, I don't want to say infecting them because that sounds really dark. But, they're always influencing one another.
Yeah, they do. I mean, I think they talk to each other. But they are different. They're definitely, I think having different mindsets is super important, because even for a creator, who's a full-time cartoonist, there is a part of the process that is rewriting or or making corrections or, revising, reviewing what you've done. And so I think even on the creative life, there's a part of kind of the analytical and there's one part that's like answers to the muse or to your passion or to your inner, prompts, wherever they may come from. And then there's another part that kind of fashions that and tailors it and can think about the marketplace and think about the packaging of it or the, the promotion stuff, marketing and all that stuff, which they are different. And if they're too mixed together, you get problems, where we get sometimes pitches from people where it's like, I can't find the voice and the artist in there because it's all this marketing. It's like, oh, look at the great toys I can market from this. And so I would say, the different hats, it's not like a complete kind of hermetic seal between these lives, but they are different lives. And in a weird way, First Second is one of my babies it's a project. It's another project. I've had to learn about business and I've had to learn about publishing, and specifically publishing in America. Because I started out with First Second really knowing very, very little about that side of things. But for me, it's always a means to an end, and the end with First Second is creating a true home for creators of this new kind of graphic novel.
Yeah.
And supporting them. And so for that, the project needs to be a successful publishing house. Otherwise, it can't sustain and it can't support its creators. So then, it was like, okay, got to learn. And it's been, 15 years of learning.
Oh, yeah.
And I would say with First Second, it's funny because, every so often we'll have a big moment, like either with awards or a big best-selling thing, and it seems kind of like we're an overnight success or we've, been doing everything right. But I would say probably the most valuable thing about First Second is like we've made more mistakes than most, but we learn from the mistakes as we go.
Yeah.
And we're not afraid to make more of them every year, so.
I do think it's interesting, not to bring up like a dark time from recent history, but there was the whole thing with the Adventure Zone last year that you guys all went through with like the pinups and everything. And I thought it was interesting to see how you all responded to it, because a lot of times there's like two different ways you can normally respond. You can respond with like anger, or you can respond with like denial. Well, denial and anger, or you can respond with like just like completely like kowtowing or something. But you all basically, the response as a company seemingly was like, we should do better. We didn't realize exactly how this like broke down, and we're going to look into this and make sure everybody is feeling right about this going forward. And like you said, it's just like every victory. Well, you didn't say this, but every victory and every loss could be a place to learn from. And sometimes the losses are the best places to learn from.
They are. I would say, as a rule, they are. They are. The moment where you have like this, you're in the spotlight is not necessarily a time that's going to push you to grow, to improve, So, and it's like you're always kind of running up against your blind spots, and it's like if you're trying to do stuff and trying to be good at it and trying to be right by the people you work with, and you are going to screw up, you're going to make mistakes. There's going to be, sometimes things will kind of blow up in your face, and it's like, you're like, well, we went in with all the best intentions in the world, but it's like, we just didn't understand a particular dynamic here or something. And it's okay, and I think, I believe, you don't have to be on the defensive if you're willing to just, when there's a screw up, to own up to it and fix it.
Yeah, I think it's, First Second is a really interesting publisher to me. I mean, not to like give you yourself too much of a big head. I have described and would describe First Second as my favorite publisher for a number of reasons. But I do think it's interesting. Like, I do want to go into your background a little bit because, going back to the original days of First Second, it, debuted in 2006. You were working on it back in 2005. And there's a lot of like fascinating things about First Second, but I think one of the strangest things is, a lot of people who think about comics now, they can't even imagine what it was like back in 2005, 2006, when the book market was not nearly as developed as it is now. Like, librarians, by and large, were not as open to comics as they are now. And like the types of things that you were doing were unusual. I mean, even the shape and size of the books were unusual. And like,
yeah.
While
back then they were.
while there was like, there was adult publishers like Fantagraphics and like D&Q and stuff like that. And then like, Top Shelf kind of was doing what you were doing to a certain degree, but not totally.
Well, in a different way. But yeah, I mean, there was some very cool publishing. And it's like a lot of it was still, kind of in the indie space.
Yes.
And now it's like, it's a little blurrier. But I would say, just on the note about the librarians, I would say that among especially the North American librarians, they were ahead of all the other pieces of the book industry.
Yeah.
Because especially, I mean, specifically the teen ones who were, back in like the early 2000s, they were basically fighting for the establishment of the manga section in the library. And they were the ones who were most in touch with their community because they had like, advisory groups, and they were actually working with their patrons,
Hmm.
which is not always the case with like adult librarians. And then with children's librarians, it's different because it's like story hour, or like, it's like it's a different relationship. But there, they were in touch with the readers. And before First Second started, I remember hearing from some of them that it was like they were saying, well, there's these Tintin, there's these Asterix books. Where's the original stuff, American comics? Because this stuff it's so battered from circulating so much,
Right.
and
Where's the new
publishers
stuff
don't
like that?
seem aware. Yeah. So and then I'd say the other thing that opened the door. So the librarians, I think, they made First Second possible. They made like all that has followed. Because in our first year, we had American Born Chinese, which was kind of crowned by the Great Teen Librarian Award, the Prince.
Hmm.
Uh, and that was kind of like the propulsion for us.
That felt like the first big moment.
It was the first big moment, I think, other than announcing, a new house, a new imprint. But you're right. People today, you know, it was such a different landscape back then, right? I mean, so we had, the manga thing was like reaching one of its peaks at the time. I mean, now it's kind of rising again, but it's in a different way. But back then it was like Borders was like adding a new bay, it seemed like every week,
Hmm.
for manga. It was just flooding the market. A lot of people were freaking out about manga, saying this is like the ruination of, reading. This is like, the end of, I mean, there's always the doomsayers in the comics industry, and it was like, but this is going to kill, Western comics, and like, but then I would say the fact that comics at that time, was like the comics shop in America was a bit of a moribund, sad kind of sight. It was not going well for comics, and it was like this kind of aging male demographic that was not renewing itself. And then suddenly in comes manga, and it's like we're talking going from 85% male to like 65% female readers.
Right.
And out of that came many creators, who grew up like not so much with like Silver Age comics, so much as like Sailor Moon or, stuff like that, Fruit Baskets. And
There's also like the webcomics boom that was kind of happening at the turn of the
yeah,
century too. And I think
yeah,
that was a big
yeah.
influence as well. And it was kind of all of this was kind of priming the pump for your arrival. I do think it's funny though. I was actually reading some old interviews with you. One of them was from 2009, and it felt like I was time traveling because it was talking about the downturn in publishing and the storm clouds in the bookseller industry. Valid
Oh,
things to say then, but it's really crazy because like it couldn't possibly be a more different environment today than when you were first starting and kind of that first 5 year window. It was almost like it kind of almost feels like from as an outsider that a lot of what you were doing, you were publishing great stuff, but it was almost like you were you and like graphics and a number of other publishers were kind of preparing the environment for where it is now.
yeah. Well, I would say, the beauty of working at Macmillan, I mean, that was one of my lucky stars where we're kind of aligning at that point. Because, the fact that I landed with the Macmillan, which is privately owned, it's not a corporation in the same way as the other big, the big publishers. Um, it's a very different culture. It's not like the quarterly pressure in the same way and Macmillan basically allowed us to play the long game, and that was, for me, it was always the long game. Like, it's funny, if you look back at the first couple of seasons of First Second, people, I remember hearing this kind of a criticism from some people was like, this is all over the place, these people don't know what they're about.
Right.
Because we had like, Sardine in Outer Space, which was like this kind of 6 to 8 year old kind of goofy sci-fi. Then there was like Eddie Campbell on the same season. Then there was like a book about the genocide in Rwanda. It's like, and it's true. It looked like a mishmash of stuff,
Hmm.
but you fast forward 2, 3 years later, and then it became clear that we were actually building from the start these different avenues. And it was very important to me, even though American publishing is not set up for all ages.
Mm-hmm.
The age categories are really pretty siloed out in American publishing. They work differently, they review differently. It's a different publicity game for different age categories. So it was a complicated gambit.
Yeah.
To begin with, right? We were like, okay, we're going to do all 3 age categories, and we want to be good in all of them. Um, but it took a few seasons to establish, like, oh yeah, we are building this kind of like this nonfiction avenue, this young readers avenue, this kind of more teen and adult.
I think it's fascinating. Like, I think a good illustration of what you're talking about is, I would probably say, just off the top of my head, and I'm probably forgetting something that I'm going to be mad about later, but probably my two favorite first second releases are, I love Faith Erin Hicks. I already mentioned her earlier, but
Yeah,
Nameless
yeah,
City is, I just love that trilogy. It's incredible.
yeah,
Also, I
yeah,
mean, like, and Faith is like, definitely has some like manga influence to her, and like Jeff Smith
yeah.
and a number of people. And then my other favorite is Nick Abadzis's Leica.
Like it's one of our treasured gems. Totally. And those were,
They
I
couldn't be
mean, we
more different.
started, they couldn't be more different. And then you can throw in, I mean, you can start putting people together, and it's pretty clear that For a Second doesn't have a house style, so it's like, and yeah, Faith is awesome. She was, I mean, she was already a hot ticket, when we first started working with her, and I loved War at Ellesmere, which we kind of reissued in full color, not that long ago. And she was coming out of that scene with Brian Lee O'Malley, and like
Mm-hmm.
there was like uh, this particular, it was almost like a little school, and she came out of that, and it has been an incredible, I mean, that she's a good example of one of the things, one of my dreams for First Second, which is like a place for some people to call home and to grow in, and to challenge themselves, to like be able to take risks and not like forever redo whatever was successful.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things that's kind of counter commercial, counterintuitive in some ways, because it's like, if it's, a lot of publishing nowadays is like, if something works, do more of that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and that works for some people. That's fine. That's, for some people that's great. But for some people, being able to always be somewhere where no one expects you, I mean, Jean Yang is another example of that. Vera Brosgol, definitely. Um, and people, or Sarah Varon, who's like, is very much in her own, she has her own style, her own world, but you're going to see some surprises from her coming, so that's something I love.
You guys published Odd Duck, didn't you?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that was her and Cecil Castellucci, wasn't it?
Yep, yep.
I That is a very charming book. I mean, it's funny because it's like, that's one of the things I really appreciate about For a Second, is the range is so broad. Like, I hype up the science comics a lot. Like,
Yeah,
the Crow one rules. I'm a big Corvid fan, and like, that's both a charming book but also extremely informative, and a very narrative, in a way that's has a very charming narrative to it. I mean, that's tough, but I want to go way back to some
okay.
early stuff for you.
Yeah,
One thing I thought was really interesting from your life is the fact you were born in Ann Arbor, Michigan, home of the Michigan Wolverines, one of the coolest
yeah.
uniforms in all of sports, but you were
True.
raised in France.
Yes.
And I think that is an interesting wrinkle to all of this, because I feel like a lot of the roots of For a Second feel more akin to the French market than they do the American market in some ways, or at least the when you were kind of getting into it. Do you feel like France, like living in France and being raised there, kind of changed how you might have viewed comics if you were raised somewhere else?
Oh, for sure, for sure, for sure. Yeah, no question, no question. And it's funny because, I came back to America, and I was like, growing up in France, I was, of the three siblings, I was the one who kind of loved all things American. And then I came back, and it was kind of clear from a young age that I was going to probably go back to the States. But I, I grew up with this French culture, and then being here for the last 30 years, I've actually, I've come to appreciate that there is a kind of a Midwest thing that kind of runs deep. I mean, my dad was a Detroit boy, and he grew up in Detroit. I mean, but we were in France, and I was raised very much French, and the stuff that was my growing up was like, I grew up on like the original Smurf comics. I grew up on Asterix. I grew up on Tintin, obviously, and those were kind of like a given, and they're not just for comics readers, it's just for readers.
Right.
Readers, it's part of the reading diet if you read. And then in the 70s, like Mobius and Bilal and Hugo Pratt, and I got to know some of them very personally, and that passion for a certain kind of author-driven graphic novel. Like when I came back to the States, I was missing that. It was hard to find. There was I could get a fix from D&Q, from Fantagraphics, but it was like I felt like there was a certain piece of a kind of a broad audience kind of comic that I was missing, and I think that drove me to, if you can't find it, make it,
And now, a quick word from one of off-panel sponsors. Macroverse is a next-generation digital comics platform, and one with an astonishing number of comics, with currently over 50 series from over 100 creators on their app, with a 5-star rating both on Apple and Google's app stores. Download the app and binge all their titles, including the Eisner-nominated Remind from Jason Brubaker, Lisa K. Weber's Hex 11, which has been described as Harry Potter meets Blade Runner, or the new queer supernatural adventure series Husk that launches on November 1st. It's just $4.99 a month to subscribe to Macroverse, with proceeds directly supporting the creators on the platform. Keep an eye on the future of Macroverse 2, as 2022 is going to bring an epic upgrade that offers a new level of digital collectability and more, with early adopters able to sign up for more information at macroverse.com. And now, back to the show. That ties in perfectly to my next question, because the idea of starting a comics publisher is one of those incalculably impossible things in my head, where it's the origin stories of comic creators are often fairly similar, but for a lot of comic readers, I don't beyond the origins of Image Comics, because it was very famous and how it kind of broke down. I don't think a lot of people are really famous about or really familiar with the origins of a lot of publishers and kind of how that happens. How did you just wake up one day and say, I should really start a comic publisher? What exactly happened? How did First Second get born?
No. So I got in. So I mean, I had my my own quest to get published as a cartoonist, and I lived in Boston after college. I was in Boston with my wife Sienna for over 10 years, just getting rejection letters on everything I submitted. And I was trying to break into picture books and into comics, and I was submitting stuff where I could for the comic stuff, even in Europe, on both sides of the ocean. And I was just getting rejection letters to the point where I thought this was going to be my lot in life.
Mm-hmm.
And then and it forced me, out of practical necessity to learn book design as a job.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked with a few publishers there. And then we moved to New York. And it was, I guess, the right time. It was in 99 or 2000, I think it was. And almost overnight, where I felt like I had just spent 12 years up against closed doors, suddenly doors started opening. And New York, a lot of people have that kind of experience of coming in, and if it's the right moment in your life and you're kind of focused. So I got into publishing first as a designer at Simon & Schuster, and really entry level. and got some very good mentoring and training on, typography and some of the basics of book design. And then within a year, I got my first contract for a picture book with a legendary editor called Dick Jackson. And he launched like Judy Blume and Chris Rushka and Nancy Farmer, some really, really good people in children's literature. And that was my first break. He showed up at my cubicle and he goes, "I've got this script." He had seen a comic that I gave to an art director, a comic of mine. And he was like, "Hey, I've got this script. It's an operetta set in a dog world. And would you like to do Tintin on it?" And I bolted home and I spent the entire night doing a 3-page sample.
Mm-hmm.
And I brought that in the next day. and I was so desperate to just the opportunity seemed like it was going to evaporate if I didn't. So I got that. And that I did in this kind of European comic style. It was called Sea Dogs, a script by Lisa Wheeler. And that went on to win the Texas Bluebonnet, which introduced me to the world of librarians and also Texas, which has actually a great introduction. And then I was off with another book soon after that. And then at a wedding, a friend of mine who had been a nanny to John Sargent, who was the head of Macmillan, she was like, "Oh, you should go talk to John Sargent." And I went to the buffet, and I had no idea what he was in the industry or anything. And I don't remember a word I said, but apparently I chatted and chatted and chatted about how graphic novels are like the great missing opportunity right now. And that all that's happening with manga is indicative that it's like the right time for America to explode in this area. And then I kind of forgot about it. And I really honestly didn't understand that he was at the head of one of at the time it was the big six, the big publishing houses. And then 6 months later, I was working as a designer and as an illustrator on my own books. And I get a call from him. And I had been trying, I don't know, you must know Calvin Reed, right, at Publishers Weekly,
Mm-hmm.
Heidi McDonald, who is now the Beat. And they were, every week in Publishers Weekly, they were putting out these pieces about the numbers on manga, the crazy numbers, the millions of dollars that were changing hands. And the big publishing houses were aware that they were missing out on something. And so I was trying at SNS, I was trying to see, could we start a collection? Could we start a line? And I was getting nowhere, and it wasn't happening. Then I get this call from John Sargent. He's like, "Hey, let's talk." And I misunderstood. I thought he was going to maybe hook me up with some art directors for some picture book projects.
Mm-hmm.
So I grabbed my, drawing portfolio and I go meet with him. All he wants to talk about is graphic novels. So then I'm like, "Oh, well, I have some ideas. I think that we should, I laid out some basic things that were, eventually that's what First Second looked like. It was like an international talent pool, but all the age categories at once, and go after, awards and enter into the literary conversation without any apology, and cultivate and develop the staff to be able to keep raising the standard on the creative side, and specific things on how that would be done and stuff. And he was like, "Okay, let's set up a breakfast with two of the heads of Macmillan Imprints." And a week later, I'm at right outside Grand Central Station. There's a famous cafe called Pershing Square for a 7 a.m. breakfast meeting. And I'm sitting there with these guys, and they just wanted to hear from me. So I walked through a vision of what, a really bold, long-viewed approach would be.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end, they were eating their food and my food was going cold, but I did all the talking. And then they said, okay, let's meet again next week, same time, same place. And then a week later, I show up and they said, okay, and I never made a resume. They just said on that second breakfast, they said, okay, we're going to offer you an imprint and you're going to have a run of it. And then we just talked about like some practical issues, from like salary and like the approach and like, and I knew like I wanted to have assurances that we didn't have to be profitable in 2 years or something.
Right.
Because that's what killed, most of the attempts that had happened around that time.
Did you get to eat your breakfast before it got cold that time?
That one I actually did eat.
Okay, good. I was starting to worry about your breakfast habits.
I was playing it cool. I was kind of like, yeah, I was totally expecting you to offer me an imprint. And I actually didn't know. I had no sense. I was thinking like maybe they were going to kind of invite me to try 5 or 6 titles, and I had made a big case about, if you try it too cautiously, you might as well not do it at all.
Right.
You're going to have to go bold or not at all. And I would say, so then it was like, okay, this thing is happening. And I shared one assistant with somebody else. And then soon after that, Gina Gagliano joined, and she was like for a long time, she was like kind of like our whole startup phase, a long startup phase. She was this incredible zealot, who went and kind of took it as a driven, passionate mission.
Yeah.
To and what's great is that she was like she, and then soon after that, Callista Brill joined, who's been my partner on the editorial ever since. And between the three of us, there was like a very real sense of like there was a mission that was more than business.
Yeah.
It was more than making a buck. There was like a drive to change the landscape for creators, and make it a viable, kind of sustainable career, and we've made some strides, but there's still, work to be done. But so that was exciting, and then I would say, I don't know if I'm like giving you more detail than you want here, but we went ahead and very quickly started getting a kind of a disproportionate amount of starred reviews.
Mm-hmm.
And awards, and in many cases awards that never had gone to a comic book before. And then, of course, the big moment with American Born Chinese at the end of 2006 and early 2007, it gets a National Book Award, which was a nomination finalist, and then it wins the Prince.
Yeah.
And it's like, and we discovered like, okay, that meant like there's like 80,000 librarians in America that are going to be buying that book.
Yeah.
Every 2 years forevermore kind of thing. Like,
I will say really quick, the one thing that, not to put too much of this on Gina, but I have to say that there are a few people in this world who are better at convincing people to read comics than Gina Gagliano. Or actually read anything, period. And
yeah.
like, I wouldn't be surprised if the people who are doing the starred reviews are like, well, this Gina person said I have to read this comic, so I have to read this comic.
Bear in mind, she at the time, we were all unknowns,
Oh, yeah.
But I think, yeah, the kind of, it was cool because, at that time, most publishers were basically settling to the idea that imprint brands didn't matter to most people, and it was over. The days of like the penguin orange spine being like a household thing were gone. And, mostly it was like about authors being the brands and stuff. But suddenly, First Second was becoming a valuable brand in itself.
Well, it's also fascinating, too, because graphics was the year before you. It was Scholastic Graphics was 2005. It's fascinating because, you two were doing different things, but in kind of you were becoming those brands in the way that things didn't become those brands anymore. And
Yeah.
it is kind of interesting. Really quick, I don't want to go too deep into this. I mentioned like the book, like the shape of the books, and like I love the production value. Like one thing I always love is that no matter what first second book you get, it's always going to be like the best looking version of itself. And
Hopefully, I mean, we get, we occasionally fall on our faces with something and like, but yeah, no, yeah, the book as an object was always a feature, and it's interesting that like for a second, our books are available as ebooks, but it's like mostly that nobody buys those.
right.
It's like, we sell hundreds and it's in the hundreds. It's like it basically doesn't really register on the radar.
Was part of that though was like you knew that you had kind of, I don't want to say stigmas. I don't know if a stigma is the right word, but there's some people, the idea of getting people to read comics or graphic novels was a bridge that they were not necessarily ready for. But if you make it the right shape, and it is kind of manga-ish.
Yeah, and it's kind of novelistic. We went deliberately for that kind of novelistic, a bit at the crossroads of American comics and manga and the European album,
Mm-hmm.
but something a little more intimate, and we were thinking could fit in your cargo pants kind of thing, something you can read on the subway, and then yeah, we had the French flaps, and we paid attention to the kind of the tactile experience of the book itself. And now I would say we're even better at that in terms of the papers, in terms of also tailoring the approach to different projects. But yeah, I think you're right. I think part of the need to make nice objects was to counter that sense of like,
This is less than.
yeah, that is less than. Exactly, exactly. It's like, this is something that's for keeps, that's like going to be something you want to keep on your shelf and, eventually give to your kids, and not be, or whatever, like something that is of quality.
It's a different shape, but one that I think the production value is like through the roof on is I love Alex Alice's Castle in the Stars. All those
Uh,
books are amazing. And also like,
I'm glad to hear you say that. Yeah, that was I would say that was our first time um, using that kind of European album, that oversized album format, which we've had a hard time. I think Americans, especially older readers, have not in the past really embraced something that, could almost look like a picture book. Um,
it's kind of Where's Waldo shaped.
yeah, that's right. That's right. But yeah, it's cool. It's this Jules Verne, his watercolor work is so
Incredible.
stunning, so it's like you have to showcase it, in big. And I feel like some of the mistakes I made in past experiments with some of our Europeans was reducing the size to match that kind of novelistic thing, and it didn't work in some cases.
I can't even imagine reading those books in like digest size. It would feel kind of claustrophobic because
Yeah, I
there's
don't
like
think it would
a
work.
infinity panels on each page.
Yeah,
It's
and
very
the
dense.
the amount of text, you have the real estate to pack in quite a lot of dialogue, right? But if you make that 6 by 8 or something, it's unreadable.
Yeah, yeah. But I don't know. I've always loved the format. Like somebody who I think really works well in the format is Jen Wang. I love Coco Be Good. That was like my first Jen Wang introduction. And it's interesting because I feel like a lot of her roots are in manga, but if she has like a European feel to some of her storytelling in some
I
ways.
agree. I feel that. I mean, you see that a lot with The Prince and the Dressmaker,
Yeah.
and you'll see she's working on this thing now. I can't remember if it's been announced or not, but her next book is phenomenal, and she's a great example of someone who tops themselves with every new project, and you'll see this like in a big way with this next one. But yeah, I love seeing. It's like Jen Wang is a great example of someone who is a voice.
Hmm.
That's what I feel for second is for, to champion voices, like very distinct voices. And it's like, and with her, with like, there's just people where, they found their wellspring,
Yeah.
and they're going to be, there's a lot more coming, from where that came from.
I'm very excited. Well, okay, just to close on the first second stuff, I just have a few more things with that.
Cool.
I have to bring up the fact that, the comics industry is like completely different from when, you first started putting this all together. The differences are massive. I mean, at this point, you look at it, so many segments of publishing are growing, but comics, graphic novels are growing faster than pretty much everything. And I am interested in, as somebody who has been a part of it, like as an outsider, you look at 2005 versus today, and it's obvious everything has changed. Does it feel considerably different to you as somebody who's been in it the whole time, or are you so immersed in it that's kind of even difficult to speak to that?
Um, that's an interesting question. I feel like because of the nature of First Second and the fact that we've always there's a part of First Second that's very much about kind of being a lab and an incubator and a kind of a place of research, of experimentation, if possible. That we're not necessarily as focused on the industry, as someone who's like some maybe different kinds of publishers would be, where there's like a lot, in some houses, they really spend a lot of time looking in the rearview mirror or looking at like what else is happening in the business and, poaching people from other houses or that kind of stuff. And it's like, and in a way that's not been the way we're turned, but obviously we're aware, it's like, before the pandemic, every year there were certain markers, like you go to ALA for the librarians convention, you go to San Diego for Comic-Con, you go to smaller regional cons, and then there was Book Expo, and every year you get a little kind of a snapshot and a measurement, and it's like some of the battles, because they felt like battles in 2005,
Mm-hmm.
have been long won.
Right.
And like now they're not really battles. There's holdouts, that are still not quite aware that there's like amazing works to read in comics nowadays, a lot of them. And it's not librarians, it's not teachers, it's not booksellers, it's parents. The last holdouts are mostly parents from what I'm seeing. But it has changed, like it has changed so much. And I feel like, the biggest thing from where I sit and for Second's journey is that, now we've gotten pretty good at building like contexts. So it's like you can put out a book and it has the benefit of the context of First Second,
Mm-hmm.
or the benefit of being part of Science Comics, or the benefit of, the World Citizen Comics, which is our line of civics books, to do our part in saving democracy, ideally. And that piece, I feel, comics, I feel, has always been mostly a lot of mutual support and people building each other up. There's other parts of the publishing business that are more cutthroat and people are much more eager to stab each other in the back than, I think in comics, my experience is whenever someone has broken through, they tend to pull up their friends.
Mm-hmm.
And, like Gene Yang hardly ever gives an interview without like dropping like 10 names, and it's great. I love that. I love that about the comics community in a sense.
Yeah.
So I think that has grown stronger. I think where we are now, there is this strength in numbers, and the probably the biggest thing is, so now, right, the readers who grew up with Raina Telgemeier,
Right.
who grew up with Bone, who grew up with Amulet, who grew up with First Second, some of those people are now even young parents, and so even with our adult titles, and that's been the hardest nut to crack, I would say, with America, is the adult graphic novel. And we have a few hits, like you mentioned, The Adventure Zone is a mega hit, and that's adult.
Mm-hmm.
And we have some nonfiction that occasionally breaks out. But in terms of the overall list, I would say we've won that battle too,
Right.
but it's just going to take a few more years to really show.
Yeah.
You know,
It is interesting where, I mean, not to open up a very large can of worms, but there is also the other audience of school boards on occasion these days, it seems, because like, and that's not all of them, but it is really fascinating. I mean, I know you've dealt with book banning in the past. I remember this one summer, it got its fair share back in the day. And it is really interesting to see that type of stuff because I mean that's not an everybody thing, but at the same time it is the type of thing that can affect you in a real way. Is that the type of thing you can be proactive for, or is it mostly just reactive when it comes up?
I mean, the proactive part, I think there's been some times when we know, okay, this is probably going to get challenged. I don't remember if we had that. We probably had that thought with this one summer, and then it won. I mean, it was the only book. I think it's the only book ever to be on both the Caldecott and the Prince lists.
Mm-hmm.
I think no other book had done that. And the second it got the Caldecott honor, I knew, like, okay, it is definitely there's gonna be some controversy.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, because Caldecott is typically for picture books, so it's like it's honoring the artwork specifically, which is so superb in there. But yeah, I mean, it's part of the reality of publishing in America,
mm-hmm.
right? It's like there's not one America, there's many Americas, and it's not as easy as like, oh well, there's Alabama and then there's New York. It's not like that, because I feel like there's great librarians in every single state. There's like readers for sure. And I would say the force that the readers now are such a force. There's such an appetite and a value for good graphic novels, that the banning, quickly, it oftentimes boosts our sales.
Oh, absolutely. Look at Mouse. Look at what Mouse is doing.
Mouse is number one on Amazon right now as we speak, right?
Yeah.
Again, because yeah. So yeah, there's like, there's a regressive side here. There's a regressive and there's a progressive, and
it is really interesting to see. But I mean, it is kind of funny too, because it always does seem to have kind of like that backlash to the backlash that results in like This One Summer becoming a huge hit. Speaking of This One Summer, I will say I find it really fascinating. You mentioned earlier about how like the people who are grown up on like, like Reina or like Kazu Kibuishi and things like that. There's this one cartoonist who I tout constantly because I think she's an absolute marvel, Brenna Thumbler. She's done a couple graphic novels for Oni Lionforge called Sheets and Delicates, and I just think they are absolutely wonderful.
I gotta see.
She is an artist or a cartoonist who never was interested in comics until she read This One Summer, and it unlocked things for her. She was like, comics can be anything. Oh my God. And now she's like an absolute wonderkind, in my opinion. She's astonishing.
Oh, that's so cool. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think This One Summer is one of those seminal books. It's like it kind of opened doors for people. And, I mean, Jillian is such a superb artist. I mean, it's just like, it's so, there's just so much talent and so much ability. And I think a lot of what Jillian does, it's not just the beautiful brush stroke. It's like the acting, and the feeling and the postures, the poses. It's just everything about it, every hand, every choice of like camera angle is more story, is more feeling, and that's awesome. I love that. I mean, there's such incredible people that we work with nowadays, like such amazing talents.
I don't think it was you guys, but I will say the fact that Jillian can do both that and then also do something like Super Mutant Magic Academy,
totally.
It's just like astonishing. Like one person being that talented is totally unfair. And now, a quick word from one of off-panel sponsors. That sponsor's Bad Idea. Bad Idea paid for the sponsorship, but they won't give me anything to promote since they're over. So here I am saying the name Bad Idea. Contractually. I have to. That's it. Bad idea. Their thing, I guess. And now, back to the show. we're gonna move on from for a second. I do want to. We're gonna close by talking about your graphic novel series, Five Worlds, with your brother Alexis Siegel and artist Xanthi Buma, Matt Rockefeller, and Boya's son. And it has been described, I think, pretty succinctly in a, it gets the job done. Star Wars meets Avatar: The Last Airbender. It's a 5-book series, and its conclusion came a couple weeks ago with its 5th volume, The Emerald Gate. As I told you before, I just started reading the series. I'm only on the 1st book. I didn't want to jump in on the 5th book because that felt like a betrayal to the process.
No, and you would. I think it would make no sense whatsoever. You really do need to read this one in order. So yeah, I'm glad you did.
I told you beforehand, and I'm going to say this just because I've been very public about how much I love Amulet as a series. It has big Amulet energy, and I literally have Kazu Kibuishi art. Wait, where? Oh God, I moved it. It's over here now. I love Kazu Kibuishi, and so I don't say that lightly. Like that's how much I like this. But I am interested in the beginning of this because it's a fascinating book series. It's both a big adventure, but also it's like heavily related to climate change. Like, fundamentally, it's built into that. And where did this book come from for you and Alexis and the rest of the team?
Yeah, I mean, before it started with Alexis and me, and originally I was going to draw it myself, and then as it ballooned into the story we knew we wanted to tell, I had to rethink that, and we decided, okay, let's make a little studio and do this because we knew we were going to be well over 1,000 pages of story, and it was going to be like my next 15 years if I if I did it by myself, and even then. And I'm so glad we did. It was, yeah, I think climate change is a big piece of it, but you'll see as you read it, it's also, it's world change.
Right.
It's a big world change, and it's constant transformation. Like our characters go through massive transformations, and then the worlds in question go through some big transformations. And that feels like, like I think if you're moved to do sci-fi fantasy, you're gonna, in some form or another, if you're trying to reach for some truth, it's gonna hold a mirror to your times, right? It always does. And some of that kind of found us in the storytelling. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't all premeditated. We were discovering the story after a certain point. But at first, my brother's a translator at the UN, and he was very interested in the world and the clash of cultures and the, setting up a loom at that level. And then when we started working on the characters, originally it was an adult story with adult characters. And we got a little stuck and let it sit for a while. And then when we came back to it, the breakthrough was actually making them kids. Mm-hmm. And one of the big things we wanted to do, especially when we started setting up a studio approach, with Matt and Xanthi and Boya, was I'd seen with my own kids, like for example, Bone, you mentioned Bone, like my kids have read through the entire Bone like maybe 7 times or more, in the course of like the first few years that they had the books. Mm-hmm. And I think graphic novels have this unique power that they we wanted to, basically our challenge to ourselves was like, could we do a story that was dense enough that on the 20th reading, you're still going to discover some new thing you never spotted before. Mm-hmm. And we even had, like, on the 5th book, our editor, we had a great editor, Chelsea Eberly, was working on our books with Random House. She discovered things in book 1 when we were wrapping up book 5. She was like, oh my God, I saw those posters in the street. And I'm like, it was all there all along. And it was like, that was the best feeling. And the questions, like after book 3, we started really meeting a lot of like young fans. Like I would go do school visits and like the entire class had read the books, and they would have like some really nerdy questions, about like why it was raining on a certain world and like stuff. And cosplay and fan art started coming in after the 3rd book, especially. And what we're finding is that the kids, we hear this from parents and from teachers and stuff. they reread and reread and reread the books.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, and of course the downside of that is like you have like a super dense first read, that might put some people off. But I'm happy for this. Like it's a pretty big story, and it's 1,250 pages of it, and like for those people that it clicks with, I think there's a lot of reading pleasure for a few years to come.
I will say, for a very dense read, it's the first volume is, I mean, it's very smooth. It reads really nicely, considering all the stuff it has. Like a lot of the,
Yes,
obviously
yes.
it's establishing the foundation of so much. But I do think, tying into like when you were saying about like it's not just climate change, but it's world change. I also like the fact that, and I imagine this is the type of stuff that's going to come up more, is like there are inherent biases by some of the characters in certain
Yeah,
directions. Like God,
yeah,
was it on Anzu?
yeah. Ansu, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Anzu loves. Oh my God, what's the name of the Starball player?
Yeah, Jax Amboy.
Jack.
Yeah,
Yeah. So Jack Samboy, he's like loves Jack Samboy until he discovers something about him, and then all of a sudden he's just like, your name is Mud, and
yeah,
like it,
yeah.
it is interesting to. That's one of the nice things about having so many pages and so many volumes to work with, is you can start to dig into those biases and understanding of like these characters and building an empathy and things like that. And even in the first volume, you can see the roots in there throughout. And I don't know, I really enjoyed it. But
That's great. Yeah, I love that. I mean, the fanboy, I that was my connection with Ansu, was like, he starts out as like he's a street urchin. He's basically at the very bottom of the social, pecking order. He's pretty much in the trash heap of
mhm,
society. But he's a fanboy, and he just adores this and the whole culture of, being a fan, and how that sometimes you have to let go the fan in order to, discover, each of these characters has big secrets to them, and something else is going to assert itself from inside of him. So I don't want to spoil it, but yeah. You're right. I mean, you're picking up on something that we do play with quite a lot in the next books. Like you'll see the second book zeroes in on a particular villain in the story, and it's a villain who's basically starting off from all the best intentions, and he's actually the holder of certain truths, but things kind of warp.
mhm.
So he's like he's kind of he means to do the right thing. I mean, I guess Thanos is an example of that in a way, but
Yeah.
could say, but
My only critique to the characters, not for you, but for the characters in world, is they are like way too chill in the first book about the fact that they're hanging out with somebody who literally just lost their arm, and they seem to be fine about it.
yeah, we actually had fun with that. With it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Which is like obviously there's something very weird about somebody like missing an arm and kind of carrying on, right?
Yeah, I'd be like, we need to take you to a hospital because you just had like the most grievous thing that could possibly happen to you. You lost your
Yes.
entire arm. But anyways, well, I brought up the Star Wars meets Avatar: The Last Airbender line, which I think is very. I mean, the Avatar stuff totally there. I mean, I totally get the Star Wars stuff too. But it is interesting because in some ways it feels like it has a lot of classic tropes and it wears its influences on its sleeve, but it doesn't feel like repetitive or overdone. Like it's just all fused together in a new way. Was there, I mean, besides those two that I mentioned, was there anything that really inspired you and Alexis as you were kind of building this world initially?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, we had, some of the stuff was like prose. There was like Ursula K. Le Guin, Stephen King. There
Hmm.
was just stuff that was kind of in our minds, in our inspiration. I would say Studio Ghibli and Mobius. Mobius for me personally, the sense of being immersed in faraway worlds. I feel like that's been one of my great loves as a reader
Hmm.
of comics and of prose, and so we wanted to give an experience at that level. And I know, I mean, for Matt and Xanthi and Boya, they developed a unique style that became like it's almost like a visual. It's almost like there's like another artist that's not any one of them in particular. It's very hard to separate out who did what sometimes.
Okay, so that's one thing I really wanted to bring up because the art in the book is fantastic. But normally, like I said, I think before we start recording, normally there's like, when there's three artists, it's like penciler, inker, colorist, or something
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. No.
How does it work here? Do they split up pages and have similar art styles? Is it
I mean,
collaborative? How does it work?
it's a very unique collaboration. So basically, Alexis and I would script and get to kind of it wasn't even a final script, but it was a working script, and I would thumbnail that out, right? And then those thumbnails were a chance to, you know, push the script and kind of give it a good, kick in the tires, and then we'd hand that over to Matt and Xanthi and Boya, and they were already, before the script was finalized, they were already doing a lot of like places and costumes and
World building.
things, ships. Yeah, they were doing a lot of visual development, and in the visual development, there were certain strengths that each one had. Like Matt has like the most amazing kind of black and white sketches of places that you just feel they exist. You see them and you feel like he was there. Xanthi is all like, she's an amazing kind of actor, and the emotion and the feeling in the characters, she brings like a huge amount of that to them. And Boya, solves a lot of like technical issues with whether it's technologies and ships and different things and much more. But then they kind of interact and do a bit of everything. So they've all designed different characters to some degree, and worked out costumes. Where we were digging in. We'd have long conversations about the culture on Moon Toki or on Munyata, or on Salasandra, and how it would lead to different types of clothing and different types of architecture and things like that. Then they took my thumbnail and they start penciling, but they would each take different scenes. So when you see the pencil stage of Five Worlds, you could see three distinct styles.
That's so wild.
It's so wild. And then, Xanthi would go in and kind of sometimes work over faces and some of the postures and characters, or Matt would go back in someone else's scene and start like filling out some of the background. And then once we had the pencils where we wanted them, Matt did all the line work. And then Xanthi did all the key color, and then Boya did the cleanup color. So everything got unified, into this one style, which is not quite any one of us. It's like there's like another voice in a sense. That's the kind of collective voice.
Yeah.
And that's the Five World style.
It's like the four of you kind of combined to make one super artist.
Yeah. I mean, it feels that way. And it was like that, the project, what was so unusual was like we worked for over 7 years, like almost 8 years together on this stuff. And it was strangely harmonious. We were basically all kind of turned to giving this like our best shot.
Mm-hmm.
It was never, we never had any, like we had disagreements and we had problems to solve together, but it was never ever a conversation of like one of us like wanting, their way.
Yeah.
About something.
That would be very difficult given the structure of how you all worked.
Totally.
I will say that one advantage of, at least for me as a reader, I really like silence. Like when appropriately use silence. Like I'm not like dying for every book to be like a silent comic or something, but having so many pages to work with and kind of knowing that the story was going to be a certain length. There's this one page in the first volume, it's page 45, and it's just like, it's after Una went to sleep, and there's 3 panels, and it's just a shot of kind of like Chrysalis, and then it's like a zoom in, and then kind of like a zoom in, and it's all silent, and it's all just kind of establishing shots, and it just kind of slows you down and has some like I don't know, good atmosphere to it. And if you didn't have that length to work with, you probably would have cut that. But because you have that length to work with, it works so much better.
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear you say that. I love that stuff. And I feel like we got uh, we got better as the series went at actually building in. It's not just a pause. It's like sometimes there's actually real emotional content, with characters,
Mm-hmm.
and it's wordless, and I love that comics can do that. There's the there's sometimes you can do a lot of character building by kind of dialing down the dialogue,
Yeah.
for a bit. But you'll see later in book 3, there's like a bunch of teenagers who kind of have secondary roles in the story and just the kind of giving ourselves the room to have the little interactions between them without, dragging on the plot, but was great. It was great. It was so much fun. And I think we got the knack a little more as we went.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, like I'm actually excited to read the rest of them. It was funny because I was like, "There's no way I can read all 5 books," and I read the first book, and I'm like, "I'm going to read the rest of the books." I mean, not that I wasn't going to begin with. I didn't have any fundamental issue with it. I have to admit, like this is terrible. One of the things for me is like I only have the digital copies. I'm like so much
Oh,
better at
no.
reading print copies than digital, and it's
Oh,
just
yeah. And the books themselves, like we had some fun with the case, and also you put them together and the spines make a picture and then the
oh,
cases tell a story, when you have the 5 cases under the jacket. And you get some really cool, especially on the hardcover, there's like a nice big map and also a little, there's an intro to the planets from the point of view of each world in each book.
you're speaking my language right now, Mark.
I mean, it's geek, book geek stuff that,
I love it. Yeah, I'm
yeah,
all
yeah.
about it. I will say, and not to tout another book within the book, but basically, like listening to you talk about the silent stuff, you got to read that Brenda Thumler. She's gonna be so up your
Yeah,
alley.
I
It's
made a
crazy.
note of that.
Yeah, yeah. But okay, so I do want to talk about. You've worked with family a lot. You did all these books with Alexis. You worked with your wife before on another graphic novel. It seems like sharing the comic experience is like an important thing to you. Is it because your family is filled with creative folk, or is it more about wanting to share these things with your family?
I'd say they're creative, to begin with, but yeah, like with Sienna, we did 2 books together. One was called To Dance, which was a young reader's book on her life in ballet,
Mm-hmm.
and then this new one that came out at the end of 21 called Tiny Dancer, which is a more of a teen memoir, and it's about ballet, but it's not. It's actually more about healing after injury and reclaiming your power when you've kind of lost it.
Mm-hmm.
That's really what she's telling in the memoir. And and what was really cool with Sienna is like it illustrates a little bit the process of working, at least with her, but working with family. But she understands the language of ballet, which I was not warm to begin with,
Mm-hmm.
and I understand to some extent the language of comics, which she was not especially warm to begin with. So it was like our 2 languages could kind of mesh with each other, and in the process, she really got a real introduction to the comics medium. And I got to learn like what makes people so hooked on ballet, like I got to feel the feeling that you get, when ballet transports you,
Mm-hmm.
and now she has her favorite comics, that she reads. And so I feel like the partnerships and the collaborations are always like it's like a meeting of 2 worlds, and I do love that. And I think it's something that I try to encourage cartoonists that I publish is to switch between solo projects and collaborations.
Because you can kind of learn from one another.
Yeah, yeah, totally, totally. Your collaborations will pop you out of your comfort zone, and will the rough edges on your ego are gonna get at some point rubbed in the tumbler,
Yeah.
and that's a good thing.
And you learn things about the process and how you can make comics in a different way than just like reading comics because you're kind of in it together and you have to realize, I don't want to say sacrifice, but you have to flex for each other and everything.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, to close, I'm gonna this is gonna be a very big question, but I feel like you're up to it. I mean, throughout this, we've talked about, the story of First Second, this giant story of Five Worlds. You've been in comics for a while. You've done a lot of great things. I'm sure you have a lot more to come. I mean, for you, comics are in a great place. First Second's in a great place. I mean, Five Worlds just finished. You're in a great place. What do you hope is next? Like, do you have grand aspirations for the future for Mark Siegel, or is it more just about continuing to build and continuing to do what you're already doing?
I think it's important to have impossible dreams to reach for always. And First Second, in 2005 was an impossible dream. I mean, I was, basically at the bottom of the rung of the design career, not making enough to live on. And the thought of somehow getting to set something up First Second was a total pipe dream, and then it was by 2013, it was we were outpacing the dream.
Right.
And it was getting bigger than I had envisioned to begin with. And, so yeah, I have dreams. I have there are a lot of interesting experiments that we're running inside of First Second, different kind of collaborative critique experiments with creators for other creators. I have one of my crazy dreams is a story farm. And it may be an impossible dream, but it's it keeps my mind stretching to big, crazy things. But I love the idea of a space that has a mix of collective workspaces and individual studios and also places for the kind of feedback and editorial, but in a beautiful setting, with a healthy lifestyle that is not it's not a retreat. It's a place of intensive creative energy. But I've held this dream for a while, and I think maybe this might come to pass. Now it's starting to feel like it may not be so far off. It's one of those crazy dreams, and crazy dreams sometimes have a magnetic power to them. And they pull in the people who are going to make it possible.
Yeah. I mean, you have to have something to aim at if you're going to continue to build.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, I wouldn't surprise you by saying I'm a fan of all this stuff, but I really appreciate you taking the time to come on here and talk about First Second and Five Worlds and everything you've been doing.
Thank you so much for having me, David. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with Mark Siegel, the founder and editorial director of First Second. You can find him on Twitter at Mark Siegel Books. Love Off Panel and want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating and review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel. And when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site, Sketched, at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content, and its members-only forum. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking it on Facebook at /Sketched. That's SKTCHD. Follow on Twitter and Instagram at @SketchComic or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Patrick Hoyle, Devin Fitzsimons, Rom V, Nick Walker, Isaac Warren, Scott Carpenter, Rent Narbs Studios Comics, Nicholas Palmieri, Capes and Tights Podcast, Klaus Van de Ven, Brian, Submit Industries, Raj Patel, Jack Mulqueen, Kyle, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Elliot Metz, Dr. Lou, Scott Hazelwood, Scott Buwan, Michael Tunk, Canadian by Proxy, Johnny Cannon, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Brower, Declan Shalvey, Dan Garino, Josh Williamson, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, SB, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, AbductedTheComic.com, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Charlie Chu, Stephen Hall, Pensacola Pop Comics, Kim Esland, Philip Myra, Christian Shelton, Kenny Porter, Chris Pachalo, Torrin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Carl Mizell, Danny Ollie, Paul Salates, Akil Wilson, Alex Demetriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vita Ayala, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, WMQ Comics, Akil Kokachi, Sean Pinello, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Robert Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Brendan Fletcher, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendrick, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Michael Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comic Star in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.